Tonight on BBC One, the magazine programme See Here.
I think what's interesting in the courtroom situation is the number of errors occurring in sign language, how much is misunderstood, and the fact that there's no one around to put a stop to it, because the judge doesn't understand what's being signed.
I am very disturbed over the failure of both the law courts and Parliament to understand the problems of deaf people and to ensure equality of justice. What we've got now is injustice, and that simply won't do and must be changed.
I understand that both the European Convention on Human Rights and English law requires that there should be an interpreter used in the legal process where necessary, and that non-English speakers should be involved with an understanding mind. The problem seems to be that we don't have the quality of skills and structures to meet what is required by law.
I think it's such a fundamental part of the whole process that the legal profession and the judiciary receive full deaf awareness training.
The problem with using interpreters that are not properly qualified is that they have never been vetted, and we have no way of knowing whether they are any good or not.
How can we talk about justice when deaf people are denied access to an important part of the decision-making process in court?
Hello. Some provocative thoughts there from a group of people with a great deal of knowledge and interest in the difficulties which deaf people have in areas that most people take for granted. The ordinary, common, everyday difficulties which deaf people have getting access to society is such a wide subject. We've decided to narrow the focus and look at the law and justice. Are deaf people really being treated fairly? That's what we're looking at today. I'd like to start with you, Mike. Let me ask you about your statement that deaf people are being denied access to the decision-making process. What do you mean by that?
It's not generally understood that an important part of the decision-making process in the courts in this country is the preparation of pre-sentence reports. Realistically, there will be deaf people who have not had the same access to the preparation of those reports as their hearing counterparts. And they don't have the same access simply because you have a probation service that's not been particularly interested in the needs of deaf offenders. You have very few probation officers who are able to communicate directly with deaf people. You have a probation service that doesn't have any real awareness of the needs of deaf people or the culture of deaf people. And so in real terms, even if you have an adequate supply of interpreters, then you've got a service that doesn't understand how to use interpreters in those circumstances and doesn't understand the needs of deaf people.
Gloria?
The first time I attended a trial, there had been an incident before I arrived, and a request was made for a deaf person to attend. That's how I became involved. Now, when I arrived, I thought that the attitude was appalling, including that of the judge, the barristers, and everyone else. I had a lot of concerns because there had been 3 people arrested, 2 of whom were deaf, and their barristers knew nothing about deafness, the culture, the language, or anything. Now, I was working with one of the barristers, initially without an interpreter. Then an interpreter was provided, but it was the court's own interpreter that we had to borrow. I felt that that was discriminating in a court situation. I also had concerns that the deaf people were not understanding what was being signed to them. There were still problems of interpretation since the court didn't know how to use the interpreter. There's still a view that by providing an interpreter, all the problems in the case disappear as if by magic. And that's the problem. No one seems to be aware. They don't have the information. They just talk about the process, time and money spent. Oh, we've spent over £1 million. Since when has money become more important than human rights? That's my concern.
Clive, Gloria has mentioned some of the problems of using interpreters. Have you been through those experiences of negative attitude to the deaf person?
I think it's ignorance rather than poor attitude. I think that many courts, many people in the courts, when a deaf person appears, it may well be the first time in their lives they've ever had any contact with a deaf person or seen sign language in action. And it's just such a totally strange experience or unusual experience for people that they don't quite know how to handle it. And it really comes back to the point that Gloria was making about that when those kind of cases are coming up in court, that the court and everybody involved needs some preparation, not necessarily about the facts of the case or whether somebody's innocent or guilty, but preparation about what kind of issues may come up that they're not used to, issues of deaf culture, issues of sign language, the problems that interpreters may experience.
Thank you. Jack?
Well, this is crucially important, the provision of interpreters, but there's a significant number of people who have very little hearing or no hearing who don't sign, and it's imperative that they should be given textual communication so that they can follow the proceedings in court. Now, in Parliament, I've had the text communication for some years now, and it may be necessary, it is necessary, to provide for those people who don't sign but who are deaf this kind of palantite provision. Without it, deaf people without signing are simply lost, and I think it's time that a big change is made in courts of law providing this kind of system.
I'd like to come back to you on that. You've been involved in drafting legislation. Why not put together some legislation now that would solve the problem?
I have, in fact, tried to bring things in the House of Lords to do with deaf people and make provision for them over a very wide range of issues, especially in the Disability Bill, which was before Parliament a few weeks ago. But each time I've been turned down by ministers. And so it's not for lack of trying, it's for lack of support from the government. But that doesn't mean the end of the efforts. The efforts will be continued later on, and certainly later this year and in the new year as well.
We've talked about problems of attitude and so on, but you mentioned awareness. Could increased awareness solve the problems? What do you think?
I think that it will help the process along, but I think we have a long way to go before we can really say that the judiciary, the people who are conducting cases, do really understand deaf awareness issues, the issues that Gloria and Clive have been talking about communication, deaf culture, and so on. Last year, we had 2 meetings with the Lord Chancellor to try to explain to him some of the problems which were being experienced and to see if he can assist us in setting up a deaf awareness training program for the judiciary. There is a body called the Judicial Studies Board, which would appear to be the ideal mechanism for providing this training. So we presented a paper to the Lord Chancellor, and he has passed it on to the board, and we hope that way awareness will filter down to all ranks of the judiciary, so that there should be no excuse in the future for some of the problems which have occurred from keep coming up.
Do you think that that would solve a lot of the problems, some of the problems? Lord Ashley has talked about legislation, but would awareness really have a big effect, do you think?
Well, I think awareness is more likely to be useful than legislation, because the Lord Chancellor doesn't have that much power over individual judges. It is very much up to individual judges as to how they conduct their cases. And I think that that is where the problem about deaf people who want to be on juries come in, because the law structurally cannot tell a judge to appoint a deaf person to sit on a jury. It has to be left up to the individual judge. It is his decision. So deaf awareness should assist to prevent judges from basing their decision on mistaken information or out-of-date assumption about deaf people and language.
In the disability bill, the discrimination disability bill going through Parliament now, or just going through Parliament, I tried to get provision for deaf jurors, and I thought I had won. But a minister said we can't have deaf jurors, regardless of whether they've got interpreters and transcription and all the rest of it. I was appalled at this, and I wrote to the Lord Chancellor and said I thought we were going to have deaf jurors, and he said no, because the judge, the Recorder of London, had made a ruling that we couldn't have deaf jurors, and there were a couple of grounds for that. Do you know what they were? He said, firstly, in a jury, everybody may be speaking at once, and so an interpreter couldn't follow. Now, as if in juries everybody speaks at once, and if that happens, then hearing jurors couldn't hear anyhow, so that's a quite ridiculous case. And the second reason, he said, is that we can't have interpreters speaking in a jury room, and that's what they will do. This was the Recorder of London as a preposterous proposition, and that's a slur on interpreters who are very professional and are trained to interpret without interfering in the discussion. On those two bases, the Recorder of London said no deaf jurors. So now the thing is back with the Lord Chancellor, and I've asked him to reconsider. Shows the extent of the problem, though, for deaf people.
I'd like to come to you now, Anne. You've written a handbook due for publication soon, which refers to non-English speakers. Do you include deaf people in that, or does that only apply to spoken languages?
It is primarily about speakers of other languages, but my colleagues in the CACDP advisory, notably Clive over there, went through the book and pointed out things that apply particularly to deaf people, because the principles are exactly the same, the basic principles, although there are some differences. But it brings up three quite different action that we have to address. One is interpreters, which we've spoken about. The second is the training for people on how to work through interpreters and how to work across language and culture, which Richard's talking about. And also the third thing is informing people who don't speak English for one reason or another, or informing deaf people about the law, or giving them access to that information so that they can participate with an understanding mind if they are involved in the legal process, not just to safeguard their rights, but also to allow them to exercise their responsibilities as full citizens.
Jack, you've talked about legislation, and Anna's talking about non-English speakers. Do you think that they and deaf people should campaign together to then have a better chance of having legislation introduced?
It is impossible for me to try to identify and compare these two groups. All I know is that discrimination against deaf people in law and in Parliament is very significant and very considerable. And the fact that the Lord Chancellor accepts the word of a judge making a false judgment about interpreters and about jurors all babbling together is indicative of the extent of the problem. It's a very major problem that even goes so far, the judge went so far as to say there is case law saying that a 13th person is not allowed in the jury room. I know of no case law. So either it was wrong to say that there is case law against the 13th person, and if there is case law, then the law should be changed because it's wrong.
Richard?
There is a case which says that a certain person cannot be in the jury room, but it dates back to 1915, so time is right for us, obviously, to take account of the fact that we've moved on since 1915, and really there should be no excuse for confusing the role of an interpreter who was there purely in order to interpret the proceeding for a deaf juror.
Both you and Jack have talked about case law, but what about deaf professionals in the courtroom? Not all deaf people in court are jurors, so let's leave that for now. Nor are they all defendants. Some deaf people attend court in their professional capacity, such as social workers or even yourself as a solicitor. What happens then? How do they get access?
I've been lucky in that when I have had to go to court, I have been well served by my interpreters, and I normally make a point of notifying the court beforehand, if possible, so that they are aware that there will be a deaf person in court and I will be bringing an interpreter. I think the issue for people like myself and for others like deaf social workers is that, as with any other deaf person, we need an interpreter or a communicator, whichever is appropriate in court. But because of the requirements of our job, the particular need for us to be in court to perhaps present a case or to give evidence or whatever, we need to make sure that the support and the assistance we have is of the highest possible caliber.
See here has received a letter from a police officer outlining a number of points. One being that deaf people should have the right to choose. Why should they have to have a fully qualified interpreter? He also says that there are a lot of deaf people out there who don't need fully qualified interpreters, that they could manage with somebody with stage 1 or stage 2. So I'd like to ask you, Clive, would you agree with that idea? So that if I was going to court, I could request someone with stage 2 saying, that's good enough for me. You said at the beginning that interpreters need to be vetted, so what do you think of the officer's view?
The real issue here is about vetting and about the fact that if the deaf person chooses their interpreter, the deaf person has no way of knowing whether that interpreter is doing an adequate job or not. If you have only got skills in one language, whether it's BSL or English, you have no way of knowing that the interpreter's translation into the second language is any good or not. That is why it is important that the interpreter that is used has been vetted, so that they have been judged by a neutral organisation, CACDP, who have made some basic decisions about that interpreter's ability to function in two languages and to interpret and translate between those two languages.
Gloria?
I'd like to give you an example of why interpreters need improved training. When I was in court, there was a question from the barrister which was, "Do you know where the old man lives?" The interpreter relayed this and the deaf person took it in and signed back, "Oh yes, I know the house, but I don't know which door." The interpreter's reply was, "Yes, I know the old man's house." Now, the fact is that what I saw was completely different from what the interpreter saw. What he was actually saying was that he knew the area and the terrace where the house was, but he didn't know the exact address or what the number was on the door. This is where the interpreting fails. I don't mean that the interpreter has failed. Their training is the problem. In addition, interpreters are not prepared for meeting people with differing levels of language within the deaf community, and that is a big problem. I feel that it's vital that this is sorted out first. If it is, then maybe the situation can be improved. In court, people are sworn to tell the truth, but if they're interpreted wrongly, imagine what can happen to their lives. I feel it's so important.
I think there's various points that come out of Gloria's very interesting and perceptive comments. First of all, I think it's useful to point out that an interpreter, by definition, has two clients. The English-speaking one and the non-English-speaking one, and they have an equal duty to both for mutual communication. A lot of interpreters are very reluctant to work in areas where life and liberty might be at stake, particularly in the high-profile areas of the legal system, not because they don't want to help, but because they don't have confidence in their own skills. And the only way you overcome that is by they are asking for more training. But that's expensive to do well. And I think we've got to stop this short-term bookkeeping approach and invest in cost-effective long-term development by getting people properly trained. And on the thing of language, yes, indeed, all language, even spoken languages, have ranges so that you get, I come from the northeast, so I'm bilingual in a sense in Geordie and posh. And there are different sorts of the same language. And the public service interpreter has to be able to interpret, if possible, in the whole range of the way people express themselves in a particular language.
I'd like to ask you, Clive, in your experience, is there more potential for mistakes working with sign language? We've had the example of the door, but would that happen with spoken language interpretation? Would it? I'd like to ask you what you think.
I'm not an expert in foreign language interpreting, of course, but I've seen and experienced, and I'll admit it, I've done it myself occasionally, countless examples where the significance of what is going on in the court and an understanding of the language and the way it's used and the importance of it in, for example, a court situation has led to a misinterpretation. Take, for example, the word hit. Did you hit the child? Is the question. How the word hit is interpreted, whether the interpreter uses a punch sign or a slap sign, will radically change the answer that the deaf person may give. So the deaf person may appear to have denied hitting the child when actually they slapped and didn't punch, and the interpreter used a punch sign for the word hit. A very simple example, but one of the important points I'm making there is that it is the interpreter's awareness of the importance of that issue in a legal context that is important. If the interpreter has had high quality training on what is involved in a court situation and how to handle it, they will be aware of those kind of dangers and trip points, if you like. But without the training, they may not be aware of it. And they will therefore, and the rest of the court won't be aware of it either.
Gloria.
Yes, I agree with Clive, but I think it's important to go back a step here. Before these people become professional barristers and judges, they must have, as part of their training, an insight into disability, deafness, being deaf-blind, or deafened, and so on. They have to have some knowledge about that before they can make judgments on people's lives. After all, outside the Old Bailey, it states that you will get a fair trial, showing the scales of justice. Where's the fair trial for deaf people? I think that people who call themselves professionals should know this. It should be part of their training before they enter the profession. I also understand what Clive said about interpreters. There are lots of problems with interpreters. It's not just a word. I mean, they're individuals, people with their own personalities and attitudes, and that can be a problem. They have their own difficulties stemming from their training. They're not trained in law. When I was asked into court, I learned something. The interpreter was brought in and the judge asked, "Are you a registered interpreter?" They replied, "Yes." Now, what that meant to the judge and what it meant to me were quite different. The judge doesn't know what the standards are or what being registered means. They would expect it to mean that they had been trained in the intricacies of law, but they haven't. They've simply learned how to communicate with deaf people. That creates a lot of problems, and it needs to be sorted out to stop this happening.
I think Gloria is absolutely right in pointing out the kinds of errors that have happened with interpreters. She is highlighting the importance of high quality training for interpreting, and at the same time is highlighting why it is not satisfactory to use someone who has not had interpreter training. Knowledge of a language at a very high level is one thing. If I have a stage 3 in sign language, it means I am able to put my own thoughts into sign language. But an interpreter has to be able to put other people's thoughts into sign language. And that is an enormous difference of approach and thinking. And that interpreter's got to be able to do that with accuracy and in an appropriate manner, and following a code of practice and a code of ethics about things like confidentiality and areas like that that the deaf community are quite rightly concerned about. And somebody with a stage 1 or a stage 2 or a stage 3 has had no training in any of those areas. They have simply learnt the language.
Mike?
I think that for someone observing in a magistrate's court on a regular basis, one has to accept that there is a greater recognition of other spoken languages than there are of BSL. And that if in fact you were speaking Punjabi or Gujarati, then there is a proper recognition that an interpreter is needed. I think that when you have a profoundly deaf person appearing in court, then very often the lack of understanding, the lack of awareness of both solicitors, clerks and magistrates all mean that the end result is that we can do without an interpreter. We can get by, we can use a member of the family or do it in some other way. I think that is a real problem. I wonder if I could just go back, though, to a point that Gloria was making, and I think that that is very important. It seems to me that so often there are groups of people who are doing things for deaf people rather than deaf people doing things for themselves. And one of the things that we've done recently in Birmingham is to produce a video. And it's a very simple video, a very simple storyline, but the purpose of that video is to begin the discussion in the deaf community about their needs and about their rights, so that deaf people in different situations can begin to demand their rights and do it for themselves rather than having others do it for them.
Thank you all very much. We've not really solved anything here today, but we have raised some important issues. Airing difficulties can lead to solutions. The important point to remember is that deaf people need access, as do deafened and hard of hearing people, to society and to democracy. There's also a responsibility to allow our participation. It's ironic that whilst many deaf people would welcome the opportunity of serving as a juror, the reaction of many hearing people to being called to serve is less than enthusiastic. It's all about rights. They have the opportunity to refuse or reject a right. But for us, well, chance would be a fine thing.